morning and welcome to Sunday Coffee, Art, Design, and Architecture. This is Holiday Week 2022, and instead of the chilly beaches of the Gulf of Mexico this morning, we are coming to you from a warm, cozy chair with an extra hot cup of chai tea or coffee. My motivation for this podcast channel is to broadcast good news stories, interesting people, and food for thought. So pour yourself a nice hot cup of tea or coffee, take a deep breath, get cozy, and enjoy a break for some uplifting conversations. And today's guest is Darlene Crone Todd. She is a psychology professor at Salem State University in Massachusetts. She is also a board member for the B.F. Skinner Foundation at Harvard. Hi, Darlene. Welcome to the show.
Thanks. It's good to be here, Tricia.
I'd like to know what's in your coffee this morning.
Well, mine is a medium roast that I did as a pour over, and I add a little bit of cinnamon to it.
Oh, that sounds good.
It's delicious.
I have a nice extra hot cup of chai with a little extra ginger.
Ooh, that does sound good.
It's really chilly here. Is it chilly up there in Massachusetts for you this morning?
Well, it's been pretty cold the last few days, but we're on a warming trend. So that means that the house doesn't quite heat up as much. So it feels a bit damp and chilly. So coffee's just perfect to take the chill off.
Well, here in Florida, we dipped down this week to 20.
That is cold for your parts.
We are chilly to the bone. That's why I'm all bundled up here in this cozy chair for this conversation. And I think that goes to what we're going to talk about too with behavior analysis.
Indeed, it does.
Well, let me ask you, for our audience, could you tell them a little bit more about yourself and your academic credentials?
Started my undergraduate degree actually when I was in my mid-20s. And I earned all of my academic degrees at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, Canada. So as we're talking about chilly mornings, I know that my friends and family up there have very cold weather as well, and they've had a pretty cold holiday season. But the University of Manitoba, I earned a Bachelor of Arts in an honors degree in psychology, and then Master of Arts in experimental psychology, and my PhD in experimental psychology. So my credentials are really in the experimental analysis of behavior and also getting into applied areas of behavior analysis as well. I completed my postdoc after my PhD at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine in behavioral pharmacology, where I worked on contingency management studies, clinical trial studies in ways to help reduce the use of injection drugs among people who are addicted to different types of substances. And I've been a faculty member, full-time faculty, tenure track or tenured faculty member now for almost 20 years. So my first faculty position was for 3 years in Mississippi. And since 2006, I've been at Salem State University, where I created and coordinate or direct the Master of Science in Behavior Analysis program.
Oh, interesting. Well, that's quite a background. Let me ask you, how did you learn about behavioral analysis and why did you find it interesting to pursue it?
That's a great question. And I was thinking about this. I've written about it in some different places. I think, because I had this sort of non-traditional introduction into being an undergraduate, I had been working for a while and had held different positions where I might be a supervisor or in different positions in retail and in banking. I actually found that some early coursework in organizational behavior management and communication sort of led me into thinking, oh, this is really neat. I think these different perspectives in psychology, and I seem to gravitate more towards the learning perspective, as it was called. When I took an intro psych course, I'll never forget what stuck with me was the textbook was full of funny little puns. Like, why are psychologists like magicians?
I don't know why.
Because they pull habits out of rats. and And I thought, "Oh, that's really interesting," and of course, at the time, my friends and I would talk about, "So what are we going to learn from rats or pigeons, and how do we relate that to humans?" And then, of course, that answer became more clear as we understand that there are regularities in behavior and some differences between species, including humans. But I really think my early introduction in that first year was psychology, and I was taking physical and cultural anthropology and sociology and philosophy. And those were coalescing for me in such a way that by the time I started my second year, and we had this really influential teaching assistant who was taught our lab for research methods and stats. And he said, "Oh, if you're interested in going into graduate school, you need to seek out a professor that you're interested in working with, just to find out more about their research, what they do. Because, if you're going to complete a master's or a PhD, you're going to have to do some significant amount of research because you've got to be able to do it, to write and to be able to run studies, and so on and so forth." So, as I was taking this course in what was then called behavior modification, from Dr. Joseph Pear, and he co-authored a book in behavior modification with Gary Martin at the University of Manitoba. I thought this book is really speaking to me. you know, this book is, yeah, this is like how you think about good supervision, good leadership, good training of people in the workplace, which is the world I had come from. And it's not a simple matter because different people have different needs at different times, but also with education. I've been to a number of schools over my lifetime and had a range of different educational experiences. So I think, just simply put, all of those experiences at that time, my whole history of reinforcement and different consequences coalesced and converged at that time where it felt like behavior analysis was a really good fit for me. And I started getting involved with Dr. Pear's lab and doing work in shaping of human limb movement in the lab using a video tracking system. And I dabbled in different types of research projects over the years, but I always came back to the behavior analysis lab. And I'll leave that story there for now. But those are the beginnings of my interest.
Well, that's what struck me as interesting in that is that I was teaching swimming when I was a teenager because it was available and I enjoyed doing it. I happened into doing a science fair project, and the show director was very generous with his time. It was George Gray at the Gulfarium, and I got to go out and watch dolphin training. And then it kept going, and I read Karen Pryor's book. I really just enjoyed the teaching and training process. I was like, this is really interesting. Yes, and I did too. I really enjoyed my cultural anthropology professor. He was excellent too, and I think that that maybe shaped me into going into and understanding and majoring in psychology.
That's so neat. And it's and the more you look and the more you see and the more you think about it, the more applications you see. Like, I don't know about you, but like I took cultural and physical anthropology and I was thinking, "Oh, every time I would think about something like the selectionism that happens in evolution, and it doesn't have to turn out for the good or bad, it just occurs. Evolution occurs, and it's not like it's necessarily going to turn out well." It just occurs as a matter of a scientific reality. And I remember thinking, well, gosh, isn't it true that our behavior also evolves over the course of our lifetime and the environment selects for and reinforces our behavior? And I thought, oh, this is a great theory. I'm going to create my own theory. And then, of course, I discovered that Skinner already had. So I knew that that was, a good fit. But it was so interesting because at the time there were conversations online, and I was talking to biology people back in the 90s online, and they were like, "No, evolution only occurs across species." And they couldn't see how it could be applied to one's behavior over the course of a lifetime.
Well, that's a good segue. my question, can you tell the audience a little bit about B.F. Skinner and why his research was so revolutionary?
Well, his research was revolutionary in a lot of ways. I mean, anybody could go to the B.F. Skinner Foundation or other resources, and there are many wonderful biographies written about B.F. Skinner that I would encourage the listeners to seek out. When you think about his trajectory, he'd started out with an undergraduate degree not in psychology, as you may know. He wanted to be a writer. Through a variety of different trajectories, he ended up back and pursuing psychology. And if you think about it, who were the prevalent people at that time? The prevalent people in behaviorism anyway were certainly Pavlov and Watson. So Skinner starts off really studying the reflex, but very soon after, he starts getting more interested in what he is going to term operant behavior, which is more in the tradition of Thorndike and others who were, Thorndike had looked at the law of effect. So Skinner, I mean, just if you look at the amount of research that he conducted and the amount of writing that he produced over the course of his lifetime, he's starting off in the 1930s, publishes Behavior of Organisms. And by 1953, he's writing Science and Human Behavior, where he's taking everything he's done, all of his observations, and now applying it to the human condition. And doing so in very specific sort of ways, and then, individual ways, writing about that, but then also extending it to larger cultural issues. So there's that piece of what he did to really identify the conditions under which behavior is more or less likely to occur, and to come up with a unit of analysis, which was the response rate, to have a cohesive scientific account of behavior. I think what's really like radical about his version of radical behaviorism, and it wasn't just Skinner that got called a radical behaviorist. I think it was also Watson and others before him. But what was really radical about Skinner's behaviorism was that, unlike methodological behaviorism, he didn't discount thoughts and feelings. And this is a mistake that many people make when they talk about Skinner, and particularly if they haven't had the opportunity to actually read his work, is to create a straw man argument or a straw person argument that he discounted thoughts and feelings. He would say they're difficult to observe and to record in an objective way, but you know he would agree, I think, from the writings of William James, that really a feeling that we name comes from our physiological reaction to stimuli. Now those stimuli can be things like pain in our joints or in our stomach or our head, or they could be things that happen outside of our skin. But we have physiological reactions, and those physiological reactions include things like digestive issues or heart rate changes, blood pressure changes, flushing, all different kinds of things, even tears. And at that moment, then we tend to feel a particular type of physiological reaction. We tend to do or say things, and we tend to label our emotions. We become very good at that. So our emotions don't come up and then that causes behavior. What happens is there's an environmental shift that could come from within our body, which is caused by something else ultimately. And then, we have this reaction and we act a certain way and we learn to label our emotions a certain way. So I think what's radical about it is the thinking about how we could come up with a complete account of behavior as opposed to just focusing on, a limited set.
That's true because I was more focused on at that time teaching swimming and that. And no, actually, I didn't know that he had research and et cetera about thoughts, feelings, and emotions, but that's kind of conditioned too, isn't it?
Well, right. And I would say that anything that one would be able to say about thoughts and feelings and emotions would be theoretical, because, I think when I remember reading by Skinner and actually by Murray Sidman in Tactics of Scientific Research, which is a book that Sidman wrote, was to think, there's this lawful relationship between the environment and physiology and behavior, right? So if you think of those as three different entities, the environment, physiology, and behavior, we are still only in the early stages of being able to really be able to study physiology. We're farther ahead in studying biology and physiology than we have been in the past. But you won't have, Skinner would say that you wouldn't have a complete account of behavior until you can get all the relationships between the environment, physiology or biology, and behavior. But you can study environmental stimuli and physiological changes and physiology and behavior. But he was more concerned at that point with developing a really strong set of lawful relationships between the environment and behavior.
Well, I think it's so interesting how I've applied these principles, and there are times that I watch myself doing it kind of and watch my students in class or my employees, and it's like, snap. It almost feels like magic.
Yes.
I can't believe
Well,
sometimes how well it works.
yeah, and what you say is really important, Trisha, because people don't think that this works, and it does work. And it actually, if you use positive reinforcement to change behavior, and the stakeholders all know what the goals are, you can actually get some really positive changes, and in a very humane way that just leads to a better environment all the way around. So why wouldn't you want that?
Well, yeah, and talk about my Gulf family experience a little bit. I asked my supervisor one day, we focus obviously care and prior positive reinforcement, and yet upper management didn't really see that that applied to being used on us. Can you talk a little bit about how would this work in an actual business setting? Or is it the same as working in your classroom, the same or different? How would it work?
Wow, that's a big question. First, I'll say from everything I understand of people who have used Karen Pryor's amazing book and been trained in the don't shoot the dog techniques, is how many people come back after training and using this with their pets to say, "Gee, these kinds of techniques work really well with me and my kids now." And so it's not that the parents are using clicker training on their kids, but they're learning some really important key aspects. Like, for instance, when you have a pet and you say, "Good job," when you're trying to provide some reinforcement to them for engaging in some desirable behavior. But if you use the same tone of voice to say, "Bad dog," then the dog can't really learn the difference between when they're being a good dog versus not a good dog, or when they're engaging in appropriate behavior versus inappropriate behavior in that circumstance. So to even change the tone of your voice when you're delivering praise versus some other type of consequence or a prompt to do something different, when you may want to redirect the behavior or something, just even having different tones of voice, applying it immediately versus waiting until later, right? So if my cat does something and I say, "Just wait till your other parent gets home," then that's not going to work very well, and it doesn't work very well with children either, to some extent. But in the workplace, one of the things I find most interesting is workplaces, schools, and sometimes I think in our own families, people look for a magic solution and they want to say, "What's the thing I'm going to use? What's the incentive, or what's the system I'm going to use that's going to provide the easiest way to do this?" And we'll get everybody on board. So in workplaces, and I'll focus on that because you asked about it. I have found over the years from my time working in retail, in retail management, and in banking, is they typically tend to use a one size fits all approach. And and the problem with that, Trisha, is that when people are at different stages of their careers, different types of activities or incentives are going to work as reinforcers. So somebody early on in their career, for them, money and bonuses might be very important because things are expensive and they're trying to earn more money. As somebody gets more into mid and late stage careers, perhaps, having more flexible work time, or, earning different types of opportunities to be creative or have more time spent doing other types of activities in the workplace, or even having time off. Any You can think of any of a variety of things or activities that might make the job more enjoyable. So different strokes for different folks is what I learned from Martin and Pear. And the people in the applied world know this, that you have to do a preference assessment almost every time you sit down to work with a kiddo. And workplaces need to do preference assessments before they roll out any type of incentive package. What is it that people want what is it that people want as their incentives? What they want to work for? What are the options? And allow for some differentiation there.
Well, that's interesting because I was talking to my mom this morning and we're talking about this interview coming up, and she said, I just couldn't believe that my workplace gave us a bucket and a shovel and told us, here, isn't this nice? You can all go out and enjoy a day at the beach making sandcastles. And she was really offended by it.
Well, and that's a great example how something that's reinforcing for one person might be punishing for another. And to assume that punishment that one meets out is actually going to serve as punishment, that might actually be providing attention for somebody who doesn't get a lot of attention, and it might actually reinforce their behavior.
Well, how do you do a preference assessment in a classroom?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, providing different options for students. So sometimes, I just taught a course in applied behavior analysis this past semester, and I gave the students all had final papers to do, but they could choose what the project was. So they could do a self-modification project. They could do two interviews of somebody in the field that they're interested in pursuing. They could write a literature review paper, or they could write a research proposal based upon some lit review and a project that they might like to carry out. So it gave them the opportunity to choose. There still had to be a paper by the end of the semester, but actually having choice is often reinforcing in and of itself. You don't have a choice, you have to write a paper, but you can choose. And I even said, if there's something else you'd like to do that meets the definition of a paper that I don't have listed here, come and talk to me about it. Let's see if it would work. Now, I don't think we ended up with anything else, but the option was there if if they wanted to pursue it.
How do you, in a classroom, say positively reinforce people during a lecture? I found some people, they threw a trinket. And to me, I revert back to, instead of training a dog, I my first experience was training a dolphin, and I thought, I'm not a dolphin. And it's unusual. Everybody's like, think of rat, and I always think of, I'm not a dolphin. Um, and yet other people, another one who had really good verbal cues and reinforcement without using a trinket. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, and I would say each classroom is slightly different, but I think if you have a clear set of criteria for the class and you establish early on what the expectations are, then as the students start coming into contact with the contingencies, shall we say, in the classroom, it does start to evolve, usually within a couple of weeks. So, I'll use depending on the class and the level, I use a mix of different behavioral types of teaching methodologies. So I might use interteaching where the students have to prepare answers to questions ahead of time and then come in and we have a short lecture and then they discuss them in groups. And I found that that actually really works well because it gets them not just sitting there for 75 minutes, but actively engaged in discussing the answers to the questions. And as I walk around the room, I'm also checking to make sure that they have their answers prepared. And I'll have my device with me, like an iPad with the learning management system software right on there. So I can immediately put their points in for not only showing up, but having their work done, or if they had it partially done, or if they showed up. So getting that feedback immediately on, hey, you showed up and you had this work done, or you showed up and you didn't have the work done, or you didn't show up and you didn't have the work done, right? Because the point system is there. I find it's very interesting that they start showing up all having their work done by at least the second or third week. And the other part of it is that you're right, when they ask good questions or make contributions, to really value that and respond to it. I think because you're having, especially in smaller class sizes like we have at Salem State, we can have much more of an ongoing dialogue between the class. So that helps. What size are your classes?
Well, this particular one was about 20, 25, maybe 30.
Hmm.
So I guess I was surprised at that one professor threw chocolates and another one had like some Mardi Gras beads. And I was like, there's other ways to do reinforcement that can work just as well.
Right. I mean, sometimes there may be cultural things that are appropriate. I did read an article, about the value or lack thereof sometimes of course evaluations. And one professor who gets raving course evaluations, just wonderful ones, when it's course evaluation day, he brings all of his class chocolates. So, that's an interesting thing because immediately people are probably feeling happier about this person on course evaluation day.
Ah, well, so what would that okay, let me think about that. So how would that if he brings everybody chocolates, is that a physiological we like the professor better now, or is that they really like the course better, or reinforcement ahead of time, reward ahead of time? How would that work?
Well, I suppose somebody who's paired with more reinforcement might get higher course performance ratings on the part of the students. Now, and then it depends, your question is a good one because it depends on what type of an instrument they're using to measure students' self-reported, review or rating of the course.
Well, I just had a thought. I thought, well, that would be interesting to wait then a week or 2 if you can, and then do it again and see if you get the same results.
Well, and that's interesting too because, what do we recommend in the applied field? You never go in and just start working with your students, right? Or your client. You actually spend a little time building rapport with them.
Mhm.
So if you spend a little time building rapport with your students in that first week or two, as well as, setting what's happening, then, you're probably going to be combined with more rewarding or reinforcing activities.
That kinda leads to now you said that you had in your article about zombie training and lectures in your classroom. Could you tell us a little bit more? How did that work? Well, how did you come up with this idea? And how's that reinforcing?
Well, that's a great question. So I live in Salem, Massachusetts. So we are pretty much Halloween headquarters. And actually to be completely serious for a moment about that is looking at the history of the witch trials is a fascinating and sad study of the power of contingencies over people's behavior. What were the incentives for the people claiming that their neighbors were witches versus, and so on and so forth, and the types of behaviors that people engaged in or didn't engage in that led people to label them as potentially as witches. It's really incredible. But when I moved here and I was teaching classes for a semester or two, it suddenly occurred to me I could have a lot of fun on Halloween and come up with a review session that explained all of the concepts and principles that we had been talking about for the past, month and a half, 2 months before the midterm, if I did it using vampires. And I thought, well, this is fun because there's, vampire fangs you can buy downtown Salem, and I think that vampire genre has always been interesting to people for a lot of reasons. And so I went into this class, and I first of all, I respected and realized that not everybody was going to be on board with this. Not everybody was going to be as, I don't know, as geekily or as nerdily happy about talking about behavior analysis of vampires as I was. But I said, I understand that this may not be your thing, but let's just have some fun and think about behavior analytic processes and principles, from the viewpoint of this. So everything from, being able to be underneath good stimulus control. Is it a vampire or not? Because there were lots of questions about the Twilight series and whether vampires can sparkle in the sun or not. Um, and so I did this entire thing. The students loved it. Even the students who weren't into the vampires, and I got reflection papers from them at the end of that class. So this was the best and funnest lecture we've had all year. So I came in, I gave this a very similar exam that I'd given in the past. I always change it slightly. And there were no, I don't recall having any questions on that midterm about vampires per se. It was all behavior analytic principles. And those students scored the highest out of any students I'd ever taught before. And it's not like their other tests or performance in the course up until that point was higher or doing better than previous years. So there's no reason to suppose that this particular group of students, just were academically higher achieving. It was really a good moment to say, sometimes you can just really have fun with the principles and make your lecture entertaining and fun. You wouldn't necessarily do that every single day, have, let's do behavior analysis of vampires every day. But it set the stage for the students to really realize, hey, I can think about this stuff outside of just what's in the textbook. And I can think of it outside of those examples. And I can take these ideas out and play with them.
Well, that's interesting. And I thought your example about the vampire, what is the stimulus control? Could you explain more of like the vampire, mythical vampires here? But this could apply to a lot of even workplace scenarios, etc., or even ladies at the bar, let's say. They invite you in and you said, hold out the hand and say, would you like to come in? How is that stimulus control? How does that work exactly?
You're asking stimulus control for vampires?
Yeah, you had said something like in your paper that the vampire is standing out the door and they invite the victim in.
Ah, yes. Dracula, I think I wrote that Dracula provides both an auditory verbal prompt as well as gestures in the form of his eyes and hand to invite the victim in, right? So it produces this kind of illusion of freely choosing. The vampire actually has the power of in some form of stimulus control over the victim the entire time. So if you actually read, Steve Holborn wrote a wonderful paper in Operance explaining behavior analytic principles behind hypnotism that I think would be a really good way to think about interpreting what we see in the popular culture, the vampire's use of that procedure. And so once the victim actually complies with the quote invitation, then the vampire, there's immediate reinforcement, right? So the vampire takes you into the quote kiss, right? Sucks the lifeblood out of you, right? And you have an unfortunate end. So as I think I wrote, that part always sucks, right?
Yeah.
Uh, but you can really sink your teeth into that. Um, but so you could think of, you know, how that works, and if you think about the vampire's perspective, if they've gone without feeding for a long time, that's what we call an establishing operation. They're deprived of food or blood or whatever. And so when a human victim comes along, and particularly if they look easy, to get under your power, and they're, if they're suave and they're charming, and they get you in, then they could literally suck the lifeblood out of you, right? Maybe, and maybe your question about workplaces, what looks charming and good at the outset may have some unexpected and unintended consequences. Is that what you were asking?
Yeah, just it was interesting. I didn't had thought about it because I thought, or the invitation in, and then once you're invited in, then you're now under. You've been reinforced. They've been reinforced, and how that process that could apply to a lot of scenarios.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, don't judge a book by its cover, because until you get into reading it, something that looks bad could actually be good, and something that looks good could be bad, and any combination of those things.
And how that works as a stimulus control. We'll do something practical, a practical exercise. You talked about interval reinforcement and cigarette smoking, asking your students to do a project or something that they would like to change about themselves. I thought some common ones. This is New Year, so a lot of people are like, going to exercise, going to lose weight, and you can't seem to be able to stick with it. From a behaviorist point of view, what would work?
Well, first of all, when my students do this in classes, I whether it's exercise or eating healthy or trying to quit smoking, the first thing I always get them to think about is, what do you value and why is this important? Because I think, you know, I'll say the average lifespan for New Year's resolutions is about 6 weeks.
Hmm.
So everybody I've talked to in personal training and gyms said, anybody who comes back as of, January 1st sticks with it till about Valentine's Day. And and I think that part of that is, behavior change has often small but cumulative effects. So if you're trying to firm up or get in better shape, that's something that you have to keep doing, and you don't see immediate results right away. You do in advertisements, because they take people who were originally physically fit, who may have had an accident or something like that that made them less fit for a while, and then it looks like they get fit really quickly because the power of advertising, right?
Yeah.
So the first thing is to think, like, what's the kind of superordinate reason? So people will often try to do things because they have a wedding coming up, or they have a class reunion, or something that is on a specific date. So that turns out one of several ways, right? So by that date, you've either met your goal or you haven't. And sometimes when people meet a goal, like, let's say, for instance, weight loss or getting more physically fit or something, and I'll say why I'm saying both of those in just a moment. If the deadline comes and you've met it, then you're like, oh, good, I'm fixed. Or if it comes and they didn't meet it, they're like, oh, well, I just can't do it. And so there's often, okay, I don't have to do this programming, right? Whereas taking it from the perspective of, so why exactly do you want to get fitter beyond this date? Why exactly do you want to maybe weigh more or weigh less, depending upon one's goals, right?
Mm.
Um, and look at that from the larger perspective of, what does that mean for your overall health? What does that mean for your overall ability to live in the world around you? And to also focus on, like, sometimes a change of like 10% difference makes a big change in people's lives. So to get them to focus on that, so that they might make smaller changes in how they're eating, reducing certain types of foods and increasing other types of foods, so that it's a healthier choice. Maybe getting more active if they've been sedentary, so getting out and walking more. It doesn't have to be, high impact right away. And so as people do that, and it's easier to do because you can make small changes that have some immediate impact, and that they can build on over time, they're likely to have more success because they can build those things into their life. much more readily than making a huge change that requires a huge commitment of time and energy and resources. And I think like that the gradual process is important. Your question about the smoking though is an interesting one because some people can just quit cold turkey and they'll deal with the side effects of that, you know. And if people aren't familiar with that term, that just means immediately stopping and never smoking again. That's hard for a lot of people. So I've seen many people try to quit smoking by using what we would call differential reinforcement of low rates. And so what they'll do is they'll slowly cut down on the number of cigarettes they smoke per day. So if they smoke on average, 16 to 20 cigarettes a day, they start cutting down one or two cigarettes a day less. And somebody who smokes like a pack of cigarettes goes from 20 and they get down to about 14, and then suddenly as they're tracking their behavior you see them go back up again. And that's because they haven't thought about how much time there is between the cigarettes. And so they continue to smoke the same progressively fewer cigarettes per day, but what they're really doing is not smoking the ones at the end of the day. So they get to about 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and that's all the cigarettes they have for the day, and then they go into nicotine withdrawal in the evening, and that's when you see the relapse. So what I encourage them to do is actually figure out how often they're smoking, what the time between the cigarettes is, and say they're 45 minutes in between cigarettes, then they can systematically increase the amount of time between the cigarettes. So they could go from 45 minutes to 50 or 55 minutes or even 60 minutes, depending on the person. Some people can tolerate a change of 5 minutes, some can tolerate a change of 15, and consistently do that for a certain number of days in a row and then add to that. So that actually by the end of 2 weeks, they've cut their smoking in half. The other piece of that, there's lots of other parts to quitting smoking though, and that is to limit the places you can smoke. That's already done for us in a sense, but because we can't smoke in restaurants or bars. But even limiting where you can smoke at home and also delaying the first cigarette of the day until after you have some food. So that the first thing that's hitting your system isn't nicotine. That's also correlated with success is being able to delay that first cigarette. So even if you can delay it 1 or 2 or 5 minutes more each day, you have to look at it as it's kind of a marathon and not a sprint to quit smoking if that's your situation. And so coming up with strategies that allow you to systematically gain more control over your smoking behavior is actually going to lead to longer term success in most cases.
I read that and I was really fascinated because I hadn't thought about the interval and the nicotine and how it goes through your system. Well, I guess let me ask you. Okay, my dad actually, surprising. We always kind of shell shocked by it. He quit smoking cold turkey. He had been had a health issue and he just snapped and just did not smoke again. My mom, on the other hand, is going to be asking, I'd like to eat less sugar. Would something like this apply to eating less sweets and sugar?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, how do you eat less sugar? And part of it is limiting what you have available and actually coming up with good alternatives. So, and again, I'm not an expert in this area, but I would say in my own personal experience, having, better alternatives in the house definitely helps. So having more fruit available and vegetables that are available that may be able to, take the place of eating things that have sugar.
And spacing it out too. Do you think
Yeah,
that?
and spacing it out. Actually, I've found that to be in my, like, in my own life, I've lost 115 pounds and kept it off for the last 8 years, and that took me 15 years. Definitely a big part of the strategy is delaying having any type of snack later on and sort of delaying that until later. And then you value it more too. If you can, and I remember thinking at one point, I don't need to have two cookies or even one cookie today. I could have one. There's all, it's not like there's going to be a worldwide shortage of cookies. And I guess in some cases, there might have been some shortages of cookies during the pandemic, but we're all in that together. Everybody suffers at the same time if there's, a worldwide shortage of cookies, sadly. But
Well, let me ask you, and this is kind of a recent event. Let's get a behavior analyst point of view on this. I was okay, I'm from the behaviorist background, and I'm watching the Olympics and the young ladies who were amazing skaters. And I like ice skating. Actually, I lived in New Hampshire for a short time. I love ice skating. And they were saying things like, if I have somebody has to be hard on me for me to be good at this. And that whole notion of being hard on someone so that they can learn. But the coaches at a certain point just broke a couple of those young ladies. It was right there on TV, and it was that, they were being verbally spoken very roughly to, let's say, and a couple of them said, "I'll never want to skate again." From a behaviorist point of view, what do we have going on here?
wow, that's a lot to unpack, Trisha. It's a great question. I mean, on the one hand, you know, I suppose that if somebody really berates somebody for not performing at a certain level and that person goes off and cries, then they come back and they try harder, then the coach's behavior has been reinforced, hasn't it?
Mm.
It's embarrassing to the coach, I guess, if the person doesn't perform. And so they tend to lash out. And then, I guess in that case, the person stays with the coach. So it's a little bit like an abusive kind of situation, isn't it? Or it could be construed that way. And it's interesting because when you posed that question, I thought, well, in some ways, we do this if we are setting up a program to help people transfer, generalize their behavior to new situations. But it's done in a way that doesn't necessarily involve berating somebody or providing such harsh conditions, in the sense that when you're setting up a program, and you may have found this when you're teaching people how to swim or any other type of physical sport, is they should train in a situation that's as close as possible to where they're going to be performing. When you're first starting to shape behavior, you provide a lot of reinforcement, and then you need to thin out the schedule of reinforcement. So where you want to get in any type of training or intervention is actually having the person be able to perform the complex behavior or tasks or procedures actually with very little reinforcement from the coach at that point, because they've got to be able to go and perform it in you know the moment at the event or in the situation at work or wherever. So you want to train them hard with harder tasks than they'll experience in the actual performance. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to use aversive control to do so. you know, I mean, you would actually probably be better off with the shaping, chaining, and fading procedures that are based upon the use of positive reinforcement and used with extinction, very like simultaneously. So you're placing the previous behavior on extinction and trying to get a little more or a little bit more complex behavior, but with positive reinforcement. I don't think there's necessarily a need for the punishment contingencies. I've seen punishment contingencies be used in a variety of different cultures and subcultures where I've lived and worked, and they tend to produce sneaky behavior and a lot of anxiety and stress that just is not necessary in the long run.
Well, I thought what you just said was interesting too, is making the behavior difficult or the task difficult, extra difficult. Being able to, I guess that kind of goes to a lot of Olympic training. They train really hard. I've read swimmers and stuff have like a lot of extra swimsuits on to kind of drag them down. And so that way, when you take it off, you can just fly.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, I didn't realize that about the swimming. But that would be a good example, like, let's train harder than we have to when we're actually swimming. And then you're right, you will fly. Actually, there's a very good example of that. When I was at a winter conference several years ago, and I made the mistake of being up in I think it was in Denver, um, being up in the mountains and actually working out on the treadmill. the first day or so that I was there. That was a very bad idea because
Oh,
of the difference in the air and the pressure and the thinness of the air, if you like. So, but what athletes will do and what sports teams will do is have their team actually practice in the mountains. And then if their performance is more at sea level or closer to sea level, they will fly. And I found that when I finally got over that sort of sickness that I had from working out at that altitude, when I came back to Massachusetts, after getting better and then actually doing some physical activity up there and working out and going snowshoeing uh, or cross country skiing, when I came back here and I was on the treadmill, it was like I was flying because you have worked at a higher altitude. It's actually much harder to exert yourself.
well, this is a new perspective for me too because I've been thinking about this, and instead of switching thinking from hard-nosedness to thinking of task difficulty,
Mhm.
um, would be a better training method or thinking about it too.
Right. And I just want to be really clear. Please do not go to higher altitudes and work out like that in the first day or two. Like, and make sure you're ready to do it because you could suffer some serious impact there. But yeah, I think if, in our graduate program, we work our students very hard and we have them complete, work and learning that's tougher than they will experience when they go to become credentialed. So if the training that we're taking them through is going to be, you know, at and above the level at which they're going to take an exam for certification or licensure, then we have a better chance of them becoming certified or licensed.
I just got your newsletter. I will tell everybody the BF Skinner Foundation. You have a great quarterly newsletter that I've been getting. And this one was about music.
Yes.
And we both play instruments. And yes, my band director back in the day, he told us to, when you're practicing, to imagine yourself on the field under performance pressure, uh,
Hmm.
and to practice like you are on stage. And I think it kind of goes to it, but tell me more about this is more complex, like learning music, appreciating music. Can you tell us more a little bit about this newsletter?
Well, so the newsletter, the credit really goes to the action editor here, which is Duff. Um, I hope I get his last name right. Lotfiz Lotfizida, I believe, and I hope I've done that him justice. But Duff really did a great job on this, and he's involved in the music world, and I think reading his introduction to this special issue would be wonderful for listeners. And I think actually, you can sign up for the Operance newsletter and it's free. But when we got talking about this, I thought, oh my gosh, music, and there's so many different ways you can work at this. And I began thinking about all the gradual change processes that go into, how do individuals uh, learn music, right? How do we learn to sing or play an instrument? That was the first part. And, we often do that either alone or we do it as part of a group. Like we could be in a choir or in a chorus or in a band or whatever, right? Um, and you play the flute, and do you play other musical instruments?
I did. It was interesting. I think everybody hits a plateau, and when I hit my plateau, I went snare drum. My other flute teacher
Oh,
went baby tuba. Another teacher I know, she told me she went mallets and bells.
interesting. Well, and so as a family, my brothers and I all played musical instruments. My eldest brother, Fred, played the guitar and he played by ear. He was amazing. He could play. My other brothers and I, Glenn and Bill, all we all ended up with organ lessons. I think one of my brothers had started off playing the piano and then his teacher also had an organ, so the family just invested in an organ and we all had organ lessons. That was a lot of fun. And then, of course, we did things like play the recorder in school, right?
Yeah.
Which is looks like kind of like a not a flute, but a mini clarinet.
Mhm.
And so around the time I was in grade 5, I joined the band and I played the clarinet, and I love playing the clarinet. And I tried guitar a couple of times, but I could never develop the strength in my fingers to go across the um, the strings. That just never worked for me. But so you think about all the stimulus control and music playing. Like, gosh, you've got to have your fingers in the right positions on the instrument. How does your If you're playing a wind instrument, where do you place your mouth? It's going to be a very different configuration on the flute than it is on the clarinet or the oboe, or the saxophone and clarinet may have more in common, being both, wood instruments. All the things that you have to do to play a note and then sequence the notes to play a melody. And then if you're doing that by reading music, then you have to be able to see the music note on the upper, on the treble or bass clef lines, and be able to match the note to the position of your fingers, and how you're blowing things through the instrument, if it's a wind instrument, or on a piano, matching to sample where the keys are in the notes. And then the timing, right? The latency in between the notes, and being able to figure out that this note is a quarter note or a half note or a full note or a 16th, and so on and so forth. And so the gradual change procedures of chaining, fading, and shaping that are involved are quite complex, really fun to think about. And at the group level too, how is it that groups can play together? And sometimes they play all the same thing together. Sometimes they play things that, we've all done row, row, row your boat. Probably many of us have, where somebody starts with a line and then the next group starts with that line again while the other group continues on. And and then thinking about even how groups stay together or don't stay together. What's the magic glue that leads to the longevity, right? I mean, that was just so much fun to think about, and also at the cultural level.
Yes, and how I was reading, he was talking about that how do we get reinforced listening to music? And I didn't even think about, okay, Jimmy Buffett came on radio. I am a Jimmy Buffett fan. And he was talking about how reinforcing it is to you hearing hearing music as a listener, and then I'm singing along into it in my head.
Mhm.
And how that whole that's just a big, really long, complex chain of reinforcements.
Right, and thinking about singing that in your head, but if you were in your car, you might sing it out loud.
Yeah, that's
And
true.
if your windows are up, people might laugh at you as you drive by. For some people, they may be in some situation where it might not be appropriate, but they hear a song come on over a system. It could be in a store or something, and they might just start dancing to a particular song because they had a long history, perhaps when they were younger, of going out to dances where that song was played.
Well, is that then reinforcing for the retail person that's playing music in there that I hear a song I like and I'm sitting in their store dancing?
Well, if they're playing your song, you're probably more likely to come back to it. If in and actually, as you look at, I didn't even think about this until you just said this, but I've thought about another aspect over the years, and that is how much the Muzak, that background
Mm.
instrumental music that's in stores and elevators. When I was a kid, that music was based upon musicians of my parents' era. And I've realized now that now I'm my parents' age when I was that age. And the music is quintessentially more based upon music from when I was a teenager now.
I
And so I think they're targeting people of a certain age with music.
I think so too. Well, I guess okay, I'm gonna keep going a little bit. There was, the artist known as Prince,
Mm.
and he was an amazing musician, and I came across some of his videos. His search engine comes up on YouTube, and he did a spectacular performance for the Super Bowl. And of course, I think they're targeting our age group. And how the guy could just connect with his audience through his music, and it wasn't a particularly he had a few little flashbangs, little flashes, but he had a marching band on the field, was really different. Florida A&M, fantastic band, and a very simple setup for a stage, and yet he had I like watching it because he just really got the crowd going and moving, and he really had good, do you think, stimulus control over the crowd?
Well, it's interesting you say that because if you think about stimulus control, there's also in social psychology, there's this thing called the foot in the door technique, right? Which in the world of behavior analysis, we might think of that as behavioral momentum. So I'm going to assume that there are several factors, and I would need to go back and rewatch this to really think about it. But a lot of musicians and a lot of bands have this seeming power over their crowds, right? So I think if you look at the Doors and you see Jim Morrison, you see this that they have control over their audience in a sense, and I think the Stones do this as well, right? You can and Queen, and I mean we could go on and on and on into all the list of bands that can do this. And I think there's both the history of reinforcement the fans have with the songs and the extent to which they know the lyrics, right?
Mm.
And if the lyrics are something that you only have to respond with a particular set of words, that's great. But you're also listening to the people next to you and you're learning them as you go. And there's many possibilities. One is that they just have fans who've been out to the shows a number of times and have sung along, either back in the day on an LP or to a cassette or a CD or streaming now, whichever area it is. And so in the moment, they're able to, if you put out a question to your audience and you don't answer it until they answer it, and then you say, oh, let's do that again because you didn't do it loud enough, and you keep going back to them until they do it loud enough, they will eventually, it takes two or three times, but they'll do it loud enough. And then you get to move on with the song or whatever. And this is a person you're coming to see because you're a fan of them. They've got that celebrity power. So there's probably a lot of reinforcement for following what a celebrity is asking you to do,
Ooh.
right? Or this person is up on stage, so they are in a position of power and control. So and if they start small and then they build up, it can get quite large. It's like doing the wave across the stadium too. Remember the wave?
Oh, yes.
Right? So how does that start? Why do people do it?
I don't know, why I think it's, okay, I have to think for a second. You asked me a question. You see people doing it and you want to be part of the crowd.
Right? But why? Right? And not everybody does it, but almost everybody does. And immediately there's reinforcement, right? Like immediately your neighbors are like, "Oh, good job," right?
Yes.
And you're part of something that has seemingly a life of its own, but you can see where it started, and you can see how there are immediate and long-term effects, because not only do you and your neighbors maybe give each other the high fives for doing it or the slap on the back or laugh or whatever, but then you see it go all around the stadium, all around the stands. So there's short and long-term reinforcement for it. Then you see this cultural practice, you know, continue to occur in different places and spaces over time.
Wow. Well, Darlene, I know we've taken up a lot of your time today, and I could ask you like 100 more questions.
I feel the same, Trisha. You really have an amazing background and really good sense of behaviorism. I think, which is great.
I think this is just a fascinating subject, and I encourage everybody out there. Can you tell them a little bit more about the B.F. Skinner Foundation and how they can get in touch with all of you? You've got some webinars coming up.
Yes. So the B.F. Skinner Foundation, it's really a wonderful foundation. It was started just before Skinner died, actually, and they what we do is we publish books. They're the primary resource for really information about Skinner and his heritage. And right now, we've been working on a big archives project. So actually getting all of the archives, all of the papers or photos of different types of objects that Skinner had, and trying to archive all of those. So the foundation really does depend upon donations and or grants. So we publish books. There you can buy physical books or PDFs, and some of those are name your own price, which is great if you're if you don't have a lot of funds. It's fairly easy to get a hold of the books. But if you're happy to donate a little bit more for that book, it's there. The archives are there, and there's also a community. So in the community, you can actually discuss and start or join discussion groups. The mission here is really getting the word out about better behavioral science for a more humane world. And I think right back to the question you asked about, should we be using aversive control or should we be using more rewarding types of ways to help people, perform better, do better, and enjoy a better life? I think the focus on using positive reinforcement is certainly important. And they're really the foundation is really a prime contact for anybody wanting to reproduce Skinner material or translations of his works too. So I'd encourage people to check out bfskinner.org and to look at the recent issues. Sign up for the operants issues, and they also have the back issues of those as well. And there are, I think you were interested in the zombie and vampire genres and gaslighting, and those were all part of. We have articles of the quarter where the foundation highlights particular written articles by people, and there are interviews with people on there. And I just think it's a really great resource for anybody in the field or wanting to find out more about the field. Go to the source rather than depending on what other people tell you about the source.
Ooh, that's a very good point, and that's one of my motivations. Of course, I'm interested in asking you to be here is a more humane world, and it was a good reminder for me. Get it straight from the study.
Exactly.
I'm
Exactly.
really quote quotes how to do it.
Yeah.
Well, Darlene, I know we've taken up a lot of your time today, and oh my gosh, thank you so much for being here on this holiday week. My cup of chai is pretty much gone.
My cup of coffee's gone too. I think
W-
it's time for another.
It's pretty, we might do a part two of this interview. Um,
Oh, Trish, I really appreciate it. I'm very honored to have been asked, and I've really enjoyed my time with you.
well, can you tell the audience? I always leave them with, what is a project that you're working on next?
Oh, well, I think my students are guiding the projects. Right now we're working on some basic research in shaping and stimulus control in the lab, but also with an eye towards maybe gathering enough data and doing some work with artificial intelligence
Ooh,
to see to what extent could artificial intelligence models be able to take data and try to come up with what the best procedure would be for shaping. And another piece is more conceptual theoretical, which is looking at how people behave or make decisions in a moment. I've got students who are really interested in the larger cultural issues around how people interact with police and how police interact in society,
ooh.
and looking at why behavioral skills training for police and the public are important to think about how to act and react in stressful situations.
Wow. Well, I think I'm going to have to do some part twos and threes because this is really near and dear to my heart, as everybody can tell, and I can tell you too. And I just really want a more humane, like because I just want a more humane world. We can do it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, again, Darlene, thank you so much for being here, and a happy New Year.
Thank you. And the same to you, Tricia. All the best in 2023 for a very happy and rewarding year.
We're going to positively reinforce it. Everybody have a happy, happy New Year.